He thought he had bought only land for $35, a broken ranch where silence might bury the years behind him. But inside the ruined house, 3 Apache women watched from the hearth, their dark eyes carrying stories heavier than his own. When the storm rose across the plains, strangers became bound by survival, each heartbeat louder than the thunder as rain and fear beat upon the walls. Fire would come next, and with it blood. Yet in the smoke and ruin, he no longer fought alone. And when spring winds carried riders to the ranch gate, rifles ready, they stood together at last, his scarred face unflinching, their shawls whipping in the wind, silence becoming their shield. The land stretched out beneath a washed sky, pale as bone. Dust lay thick over the road, clinging to the hooves of the bay gelding that carried Elias Turner westward for the last time. He had ridden through silence for 3 days straight, speaking to no one. And that suited him. Words had lost their weight after the graves were filled and the house he once called his own stood empty behind him. In the saddlebag against his thigh rested a folded paper. The deed to a ranch he had bought for $35, handed over to a weary clerk with trembling hands. A man did not buy land for that price unless it was land others had given up on. Elias knew that, and still it had felt like more money than he could afford, as though he were staking not coin but the last of his dignity. The ranch came into view under the sinking light of late afternoon. The fences were broken, half sunk, into the dust. The windmill leaned with a weary groan, its blade stilled like the wings of a bird struck dead in flight. The well stood half choked with sand, as if the land itself had tried to bury thirst. Elias swung down stiffly from the saddle. His knees cracked as they straightened. He was not yet old, not fully, but grief had weathered him faster than the years. He touched the brim of his hat, eyes scanning the ranch house that crouched against the earth like a forgotten prayer. The windows were dark, the door ajar. He thought of his wife then, the way she had once stood on a porch much like this, apron brushed with flour, hair pinned loose against her cheek. He thought of her laughter, soft and worn as a hymn. And then he thought of the fever that had carried her from him, leaving him wandering from one town to another, never belonging. The house smelled of dust, old wood, and ashes when he pushed the door wide. His boots creaked against the floorboards. A chair lay overturned, its legs splintered. A kettle hung blackened above a long-dead hearth. But he was not alone. From the dim of the kitchen shadows, 3 pairs of eyes fixed on him. 3 figures sat pressed against the far wall, their shapes sharp and still. Girls, no, young women, sisters by the look of them. Their braids were thick and dark, tied with strips of faded cloth. Their shawls, though torn and weathered, had been mended, with neat stitches that spoke of care. Elias froze, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver without drawing it. The eldest of the 3, perhaps no more than 20, met his gaze with a defiance that needed no words. The middle sister's hands clutched the younger's shoulder, protective, fierce. They said nothing, only stared. Their silence struck him harder than any shouted threat. He lowered his hand slowly and set his saddlebag on the floor. His voice felt heavy in his throat, so he did not use it. He merely stood, uncertain if he had walked into his own house or someone else's refuge. The air was thick with mistrust. The sister's eyes followed his every move, sharp as knives. He moved carefully, removing his hat, brushing the dust from his coat, laying his rifle across the table but keeping it within reach. A truce without words. The sun dipped and the room darkened. Elias gathered kindling from the corner, set a flame in the hearth, and poured coffee from the tin in his pack. The firelight flickered against the walls, painting scars in his face and shadows across theirs. The sisters did not draw nearer. They remained huddled in their corner, shawls tight around their shoulders. He felt their gaze even when he turned, away, as though they were measuring him against every cruelty they had known. He sipped his coffee in silence. The warmth spread through him, though it did nothing to ease the weight in his chest. He glanced at them only once, long enough to see the youngest eyelids grow heavy, Her head tipped against her sister's arm. The eldest remained watchful, dark eyes steady, unyielding. The night deepened. Outside, coyotes called from the rim of the plains. The wind sighed through broken boards. Elias sat in the rocker left, behind by whoever had abandoned this place, its creak slow and steady against the hush. He thought of his $35. He thought of the emptiness he had come seeking, and the unlooked-for presence he had found instead. He had not bought just land, he realized, but something heavier, older, a story that had begun before his arrival. Loneliness met loneliness in that room. He could feel it, as sure as the fire's heat. He by his losses, they by their fate. Whether they would remain under the same roof tomorrow or drive each other away, he could not yet tell. But as the fire dwindled low and the sisters' silence pressed around him like the desert night, Elias Turner understood one thing. This land would not let him live in solitude, not anymore. The first days passed with the stillness of a wound that refused to close. Elias Turner woke at dawn, as he always had, and set himself to the work of a rancher. The sisters stirred later, moving softly through the house like shadows that left no trace. The silence between them was not empty, it was weighted. Every sound carried meaning. The strike of his hammer against a rusted hinge, the whisper of a shawl brushing the floor, the clatter of the water bucket drawn from the half-choked well. None of them spoke, but all of them listened. Elias began with the fences. The rails leaned, broken and gray, and he set them upright again, driving nails until his arms ached. He mended a gate with planks scavenged from the shed. Sweat soaked his shirt. Dust clung to his brow, but he did not curse the work. Work was the only language he still trusted. From the corner of his eye, he saw them watching sometimes. The eldest standing in the doorway, arms folded, her shawl drawn tight. She never spoke, but her gaze lingered on his hands as he swung the hammer as though measuring the man by the weight of his labor. The middle sister tended to the house in her own way. Elias noticed her one morning kneeling by a box of old tools. She polished them with care, each stroke steady as though the iron carried memory. He thought of his own father's tools, lost long ago to trade and travel, and a dull ache stirred in him. The youngest, hardly more than a girl, kept to herself. Once Elias caught sight of her by the hearth, clutching a bundle wrapped in worn cloth. She unwrapped it gently, revealing trinkets, a beaded necklace, a feather, scraps of cloth stitched with bright thread. She held them like relics, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. When she saw Elias, she turned away quickly, hiding the bundle. He did not press. He understood. In their gestures, he read what they did not speak. Abandonment, endurance, the hard schooling of survival. They were not guests nor trespassers, but souls left adrift by a world that had no mercy for their kind. When evening came, Elias lit the fire and brewed coffee, its bitter steam curling into the rafters. The sisters kept their distance still, eating quietly from what little food they had carried, shawls wrapped around their shoulders as if the walls offered no protection. At night, when their breathing slowed into the rhythm of uneasy sleep, Elias sat awake in the rocker watching the flames collapse into embers. His thoughts turned unbidden to the shadows of his own past. He remembered the winter fever that had taken his wife, how she had lain pale beneath quilts he could not warm, her hand trembling in his. He remembered the grave he had dug with numb fingers, the soil frozen, the earth unwilling to receive her. He remembered the silence of the house afterward, the child's crib unused, the empty chair by the fire. That silence had followed him westward, clinging like a second skin. He thought he had come here to escape it, to bury himself in work and dust until time forgot him. Yet now, sharing the room with three silent figures, he felt the echo of that grief mirrored back at him. Sometimes, in the blue hours before dawn, he watched them sleeping by the fire. Their shawls drawn tight, their faces turned inward as though bracing against some unseen hand that might take them away come morning. He knew that posture. He had slept that way himself, curled against a world that had already taken too much. Elias did not know their story, but he did not need to. Grief was written in their stillness, in the way they avoided his gaze, in the way they never laughed. And so the days stacked like weathered boards, one upon another. The fences rose straight again. The well gave up cleaner water. The tools gleamed, under careful hands. Slowly, the house began to resemble something lived in rather than abandoned. Yet beneath the roof, the silence deepened. Not a hostile silence, but one born of histories that would not be spoken aloud. Elias came to a quiet understanding. Survival had bound them all, though in different ways. His own loneliness was not a wound unique to him. It was a thread running through every soul who had lived long enough to be left behind. That realization sat heavy in his chest as the days wore on. At times it was a comfort, at others a weight. But it was truth, and in the Wild West, truth was rarer than gold. The first sharp winds of autumn came low across the plains, rattling the grass until it bowed like a sea under invisible waves. By afternoon the sky darkened, clouds bruising the horizon. Elias felt it in his bones, long before the first drops fell, a storm heavy and fast, the kind that tore fences loose and scattered cattle into the dark. He set down his hammer and wiped sweat from his brow. The eldest sister stood in the doorway, her shawl whipped by the rising wind, watching him. For days she had looked on without speaking, but now her eyes carried urgency. She lifted a hand and pointed toward the corrals. The cattle stirred restlessly, lowing in panic. There was no time for silence now. Elias moved quickly, hauling what wood he could inside, latching the shed door, then striding toward the corrals. To his surprise, the sisters followed. The middle one clutched a rope. The youngest carried buckets against the coming rain. They moved as if practiced, though each step betrayed hesitation beside him. The storm broke with sudden fury. Sheets of rain lashed the earth, mud rising under their boots. Lightning split the sky, and the world stank of wet dust and raw fear. Elias drove the cattle toward the shelter, shouting against the thunder, while the sisters worked to tie the gates. Their shawls clung heavy to their shoulders, hair plastered to their faces, yet their movements were steady. Then, a cry. The youngest slipped on the wet boards by the well, her bucket clattering into the mud. Elias was at her side in an instant. She had twisted her ankle, and when she tried to rise, pain folded her again. Without thinking, he bent low and lifted her into his arms. She stiffened, startled by his touch, but clung to her braid with trembling fingers, as though it anchored her. Rain ran down her face, mingling with tears she would not allow to fall. Elias held her close and carried her through the storm, his steps slow but sure. Inside the ranch house, firelight flared against the gloom. He set her carefully on a blanket, by the hearth. The eldest crouched beside her at once, eyes sharp with suspicion, but she did not pull her sister away. She only tucked the shawl tighter around her shoulders, murmuring in a tongue Elias did not know. Elias stepped back, his chest rising with the storm still inside him. The girl's eyes lingered on him as she steadied her breath, wide and uncertain. For the first time he felt not like an intruder in their world, but something closer to a guardian called by accident. That night the storm raged on, thunder rolling like cannon fire across the plains. Rain battered the roof, wind whistled through the cracks in the shutters, but within the walls the fire held steady. Elias poured coffee and tore bread into pieces, sharing what little he had. The sisters ate in silence, though the youngest's hand trembled as she lifted her cup. When the fire had burned low, the middle sister broke the hush. Her voice was halting, English wrapped in a careful accent, fragile but brave. "Why, you live alone?" she asked. Elias looked into the fire. The answer weighed heavy, but he had carried it too long to lie. His voice was rough when he spoke. "Because there is no one left to wait for me." The words fell like stones in a well, sinking deep into the silence. None of them spoke after that. Yet something shifted. An understanding unspoken. A recognition of wounds they each carried. The thunder faded toward dawn. The storm passed, leaving the land wet and shining under the first pale light. Inside the house, the air no longer felt quite so brittle. Elias rocked slowly in the chair, eyes heavy from the long night, while the sisters slept near the fire, shawls drawn close. For the first time since he had arrived, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge not yet crossed. Winter crept across the plains with a sharpened edge. Frost rimed the windows at dawn, and the well water bit cold against the skin. Elias Turner woke earlier now, stoking the fire before the chill could settle too deep into the bones of the house. Smoke curled from the chimney, gray against the white sky, the only sign that life still breathed within those weathered walls. The ranch became a school of necessity. Elias showed the sisters how to mend tack with leather thongs, how to oil hinges so the doors did not moan like ghosts. He taught them to lay kindling in a fire that would last till morning, to tie knots steady enough to hold a gate against the wind. In turn, they taught him too. The middle sister salted strips of meat, hanging them high above the hearth where smoke could dry them. The eldest read the sky, noting the colors of sunrise, predicting snow by the way the cattle shifted in their pen. The youngest showed him how to steep herbs in boiling water to ease a cough that had settled in his chest. Their hands spoke in place of words, each act a lesson. Yet mistrust lingered like smoke in the rafters. At night, as the fire dimmed, Elias would hear them whisper in Apache, voices hushed, taut with doubt. He never asked what was spoken. Belonging could not be forced. It either grew like ivy across stone, or it did not. One afternoon, hoofbeats carried across the land. Elias stiffened, rifle within reach. He stepped to the window and saw 3 riders passing near, their eyes scanning the ranch with more than casual curiosity. Settlers, armed, the type who hunted not game but people. Runaways, they called them. The sisters froze where they stood. The eldest's hand drifted toward her shawl as if the fabric could make her vanish. Elias stood silent until the riders paused, glanced his way, and called out, "Seen any girls out this way?" His grip on the rifle tightened. For a long moment, the weight of decision pressed heavy. Then he shook his head once, his face carved into stone. "Just me here," he said. The riders lingered, suspicion sharp in their gaze, but moved on at last, dust rising behind them. When Elias turned back, the sisters' eyes were on him. No words passed, yet in their stillness, he felt the measure of his choice settle between them. He had chosen their silence over his safety, and they knew it. That night, the air in the house was different. Not warmer, still guarded, still fragile, but different, like coals that glowed without flame. Later, while searching for blankets in a trunk left by the former owners, Elias found something unexpected. Beneath folded quilts lay a wedding dress yellowed by years, lace fraying at the edges. He lifted it with careful hands, staring at the fabric as though it were a ghost. The weight of memory pressed down. His wife's face rose unbidden in his mind. Her smile shy the day she had worn her own dress. A smile now lost beneath earth. His shoulders bent under the grief he carried still, unspoken. He folded the dress back into the trunk, closing the lid as though sealing a wound. But when he turned, he saw the eldest sister watching from the doorway. She said nothing, yet her gaze lingered. In her silence he felt not suspicion, but recognition, a reading of sorrow in his posture. The days went on, bound by frost and firelight. Suspicion, fear, and fragile trust coexisted beneath the roof. Elias came to understand that silence could be a shield as much as a wall, and perhaps it was the only language strong enough to hold them all together. The first warning came with smoke carried on the wind. Elias smelled it at dusk while drawing water from the well, sharp, bitter, not the faint curl of a hearth, but the hungry scent of something larger. He looked to the horizon and saw flames, licking skyward where a neighbor's barn once stood. Shadows moved in the glow, riders circling like wolves. Danger had drawn closer. That night the ranch lay under a restless moon. Elias kept his rifle across his knees as he sat by the fire listening to the wind. The sisters were wakeful too, their shawls gathered tight, eyes darting to every sound beyond the walls. When the first gunshot cracked across the plain, the Youngest flinched, clutching her braid as though to steady herself. Then came the fire. Flames leapt suddenly at the corrals, dry wood catching like tinder. The cattle bawled, iron hinges shrieked, and sparks rained into the night. Elias was on his feet at once, shouting for buckets. The sisters ran with him, their silence broken, not by words but by the rhythm of desperate labor. They threw water, smothered sparks with blankets, heaved sand until their arms trembled. The eldest seized his spare rifle and fired into the darkness, her stance steady, the report echoing like thunder. Shapes scattered beyond the firelight. In the chaos, a bullet grazed Elias across the shoulder. The heat of it seared him, and for a moment the world tilted. But before he could falter, the middle sister was there. She tore a strip from her shawl with quick hands, pressed it hard against the wound, her eyes fierce though wet with fear. "Hold still," she whispered in her tongue, though he did not know the words. He understood the tone. Protection, steady and sure. Together they fought until the fire broke, until the last sparks hissed into silence and the marauders vanished into the night. The ranch stood blackened but not broken. The corrals smoked, boards charred, yet the cattle lived, and the roof still held. Elias stood panting, blood seeping slow from his shoulder, his hands raw from rope and bucket. The sisters gathered near him, their faces lit by the dying glow of embers. For the first time, since his wife's passing, Elias did not feel like a widower tending ghosts. He felt like a man who had stood with a family, fragile, unasked for, but his in that moment. They settled near the hearth as dawn bled pale across the horizon. The middle sister's strip of cloth bound his wound, crimson against faded weave. He wanted to thank her, but words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded once, steady, and she answered with a gaze that lingered before turning back to the fire. As they tended the embers, the youngest's braid fell loose, strands of dark hair spilling over her shoulder. Elias, watching in the quiet, was struck not by sorrow this time but by the simple human truth of her presence, the weight of her survival, the defiance of her being here at all. The house smelled of smoke and ash, but also of bread warming on the stone, coffee simmering in the pot. They shared it together in silence, weary but unbroken. And Elias knew then that love did not always arrive with passion or thunder. Sometimes it was quieter, forged in endurance, in the act of standing shoulder to shoulder through fire. It was firelight shared after danger had passed, the hush of breath when survival had been earned, the unspoken bond that grew in the space between words. For the first time in years, Elias Turner felt the edge of loneliness ease. Not gone, but softened, as though grief had given way to something stronger. Spring came at last, though the land wore its greenness sparingly, as though uncertain whether to trust the thaw. Snowmelt trickled down gullies, filling the creek beds with water that flashed in the sunlight. Shoots of grass pushed stubbornly through the frost-bitten earth. The ranch breathed again, though scars remained where fire had blackened fence rails. It was in that season of renewal that the riders came. Dust rose from the horizon like smoke, and soon 5 men appeared at the gate, rifles slung, faces hard with intent. Their leader rode forward, his horse stamping restless in the thawing mud. "We're looking for Apache girls," he called, voice loud and flat. "Runaways. You seen any?" Elias Turner stood before the gate with his rifle across his arm. His coat hung loose around his frame, his shoulder scarred from the grazing wound, but his stance was steady. Behind him, the 3 sisters stood close together, shawls whipped by the prairie wind, eyes unflinching. They said nothing. Their silence itself became a shield. "I've seen no one but myself," Elias answered, his voice even, carrying farther than he expected. The leader narrowed his eyes. One of the men shifted in his saddle, hands brushing his gunstock. For a long moment the air thickened as though the very sky held its breath. Elias did not raise his rifle, but he did not lower it either. His silence spoke louder than threat. No one would pass him without paying in blood. The riders read his resolve. They lingered a moment longer, muttered among themselves, then wheeled their horses. Dust swallowed them as they disappeared back across the prairie, leaving only echoes and the beating of hooves. Elias let out a slow breath. When he turned, the sisters still stood at his back, hair and shawls tangled by the wind. Their eyes met, his, solemn, steady. Nothing was spoken, but all of them knew the moment had bound them closer than words ever could. 2 days later, Elias saddled his horse and gestured for the sisters to join him. They walked beside him on the road to town, shawls wrapped with dignity, heads held high. He did not ride in secrecy, nor did they hide in fear. Together they passed under the gaze of the townsfolk, whispers curling like smoke through the streets. "Those, the runaways," someone murmured. "Ain't right," another said. But Elias walked tall, his weathered face steady, his scars uncovered. He carried no shame. The sisters walked close, their silence unbent, dignity intact. At the general store, Elias bought supplies, flour, coffee, nails, cloth. He placed the coins on the counter with a hand that did not shake. Behind him, the sisters examined bolts of fabric, touching bright colors with fingers both hesitant and curious. The shopkeeper frowned but said nothing. The air was heavy with judgment, but none of it touched Elias now. When their business was done, they left together. The road home stretched long, but it felt different. Less empty, more like a thread leading back to something they could all call their own. That evening, as dusk laid its lavender veil across the plains, the ranch stood waiting. Smoke curled, once more from the chimney. Elias brewed coffee, its scent filling the room while the sisters set about their own quiet work. The youngest wove braids by lamplight, her dark hair glinting like river water. The middle hummed a tune under her, breath soft as wind in the grass. The eldest sat near the fire, her shawl draped loose at last, her eyes no longer watchful but calm. Elias rocked slowly in the chair that had once creaked under his loneliness. Now the sound seemed different, steady, companionable, a heartbeat against the hush. The silence remained, but it was no longer heavy. It was chosen, like rest after toil, like prayer after fire. He thought of the $35 he had handed over months ago, the land he had bought that seemed near worthless. And he understood with a clarity that settled into his bones that the ranch was priceless now. Not for its fences nor for its fields, but for the lives it sheltered, for the strange family forged not by blood, but by survival and the refusal to abandon one another. For the first time in many years, Elias Turner did not feel alone.